Hello everybody and welcome to another video. So, adaptations of popular media are nothing new in the world of video games. For years, developers have been looking at various ways to adapt books, TV shows, movies, and comic books into video game form with varying degrees of success. In some cases, you might end up with something like Insomniac's Spider-Man series, these titles that add their own spin onto a familiar character and they draw critical and commercial acclaim. On the other hand of the spectrum, you have something like the 2013 Star Trek game, a title that ended up kind of being rushed to release to coincide with a movie coming out. It ended up being critically panned and seen as one of the worst titles of that particular year. It could be said that adaptations of media flourish more when developers are left to their own devices to put their own spin on things and not have to conform to the schedule of a movie or a TV show's release. Indeed, that's why something like Insomniac's Spider-Man works. It's why CD Projekt Red had success with the Witcher franchise. It's why Eidos's Guardians of the Galaxy game worked so well. They were allowed to put their own spin on it. On the flip side, you see how the aforementioned Star Trek had its quality reduced to fit with a tighter schedule. There's no better example, I think, of time constraints affecting a title than the infamous E.T. on the Atari 2600, a title whose performance would have dire consequences for the North American gaming market. Now, aside from movies, TV shows, and comic books, developers have also made their way over to the world of music as well, with the band Journey getting 2 games based on them for some bizarre reason. There's a game out there based on a Frankie Goes to Hollywood album. Iron Maiden got in on it with a greatest hits album in the 90s called Ed Hunter. They got a first-person game. And of course, Kiss were there as well, because where there's money to be made, Kiss are not going to be far behind. So eventually, after all of that, we come to the subject of today's video. A 1991 PS1 title based on what is one of my favourite albums of all time, Jeff Wayne's The Musical Version of The War of the Worlds. Now, this is an incredibly important album to me. This, alongside Meatloaf's Battle of Hell 2 and We Can't Dance by Genesis, were one of the first albums that I ever heard, and it played a giant part in how my music tastes would develop as I got older. It's an album that I can listen to now and love it just as much today as I did when I was a kid. I've got multiple versions of the album, I've got the live show on DVD, I've seen the stage show in person, and it ranks as one of the best shows I've ever seen. It is incredible. Now, for those of you in the know, or whatever, might not know about it, I'll keep it fairly brief. Musical version of The War of the Worlds is a 1978 double concept album based on the legendary sci-fi story The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It takes his story and sets it to various musical passages with narration by Richard Burton and dialogue and singing performances by the likes of Justin Hayward of the Moody Blues, Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy, and contemporary star David Essex, just to name a few of the people who appeared on the album. The album itself was a roaring success. It sold millions around the world, and it still sells well to this day. And as mentioned, you've got live tours that are still ongoing. They're due to tour again in 2025. Now, in the years since its initial release, you have seen multiple remasters of it, as mentioned, live tours, and there's been an updated version with a different cast, which sets Liam Neeson as the narrator. It's one of those albums that I do strongly urge everyone to listen to at least once. So finally we get to the subject of the video, this curious little game that came out in 1999 for the PS1 and was seemingly released only in Europe. It's not the first game to be based on musical version of War of the Worlds, by the way. The first one came out in around 1984 for the ZX Spectrum, and there was a real-time strategy game released for the PC in 1998. This game was released by Pixelogic, who would also release a game in 2001 based on The Italian Job. This is a vehicular action game, and it uses the album and book as a platform to tell a somewhat original story. You are charged with taking control of various vehicles across a number of levels in an effort to fend off the Martian invasion which has brought calamity to Earth. Now, I couldn't actually find too much about the game out there. An initial look tells me that it received a decent critical reception, scores being around that 70 to 80 mark. I genuinely don't know anyone who actually played it, nor do I actually remember it coming out back then or seeing it in stores. So, whilst I had seen it existed in previous years, I'm going into this quite blind. My initial thoughts are that a vehicular action game definitely feels like an odd choice for a game of this nature. I would have expected it to be a real-time strategy game like the PC version, or maybe even delving into the third-person action genre, a la something like a Sci Fi filter. But vehicular action could work. But with this being a game based on one of my favourite albums of all time, I want to give it a go and see how it is. So, let's delve in. Opening cutscene time. So, just as I had hoped, the game does actually start with the famous narration by Richard Burton that opens the album itself. The events here do play out a little bit differently to the album though. Instead, we see images of a train being stopped by one of the famous Martian fighting machines. This tripod figure cuts through the train with its heat ray, and then we hear the iconic strings that begin the song The Eve of the War before being taken to the main menu. Start the game and we're brought into another cutscene. This is where the story starts to diverge even more. Instead of trekking through London and such, the journalist main character has instead been brought into a meeting with various military leaders to explain what happened to him from the initial launching of the Martian missile to it landing in Horsell Common and the Martian escaping. So what we see here is a recut version of Burton's narration. It's set to various animation depicting the events. We see the launch on Mars, the landing of the cylinder, the unscrewing of the lid, the emergence of the Martian, and then the unleashing of the devastating heat ray. This is all accompanied by remixed versions of music from the album itself. Quite frankly, it is brilliant. I genuinely did have chills watching this. It was just seeing the animation they did in sync with the music, watching these events play out in front of me. I thought it was superbly done, and yeah, it might look a bit dated, as we would probably expect a PlayStation 1 game from 1999 to look, but it felt really, really well done. So from here, we're taking the first level. This is a tutorial made to get us used to how the game plays. The music in the background is a really lovely remix of The Spirit of Man, and our first objective is simple: drive a truck through these red gates. Nothing to say here, the truck handles fine, nothing out of the ordinary. I think graphically the game looks fine. The controls for the truck were good when driving. Music, as mentioned, really, really nice. Next objective, we have to shoot these balloons down using a static cannon. Simple enough, you move the reticule, fire the gun. You can also zoom in and out, as I learned, to get a closer look at the target. Like I say, simple. Control-wise, it was fine, but it does feel like there's a little bit of a weight to the turret, which kind of felt a little bit awkward to get used to. My immediate concern was how this might handle against real enemies, but we'll have to just wait and see. Basic shooting and driving done, we're charged with another driving run. It's the same as last time, but there's traffic on the road. Simple enough. And then on to another shooting range. This is a little bit trickier than last time, nothing to worry about. Then we go back to advanced driving. New vehicle. This one is an armoured car and things get a little bit tougher. Drive through several gates while shooting down a number of balloons. So for the controls for the vehicles, you drive using X and square for forwards and backwards, D-pad left and right steer, and D-pad up and down aim the turret. There's no reticule present to help you aim though, so honestly I found the process a little bit fiddly. I do manage to do it, but admittedly I was not keen on it, especially when up against a time limit. So we go back to a shooting range. It's a larger number of balloons and an instruction telling us how we can move faster when controlling a turret. We do it, we go back to driving once again. Same as before, only now we've got the traffic. And again, I just really wasn't keen on how the vehicle controlled and how you moved and aimed. It was hard to know where I was aiming at, and I kept on having to readjust and move around, and it just felt so awkward and fiddly, to the point where I just ended up driving while firing and hoping for the best. We do manage to do it, but it takes like 2 attempts to do that, and it's back to the shooting range. More balloons, more moving, and it's actually incredibly difficult. It feels like you don't get enough time to do this. I fail this several times, and eventually the game just moves on. It just goes, oh, Martians have landed now, here you go, time to fight them. But here come the Martians, and it's so cool to watch the Martian tripods moving in the distance and coming towards me. I managed to take them out with the gun before switching to the armoured vehicle for the ones surrounding that area. Definitely wasn't as difficult taking out the fighting machines as it was the air targets. Still awkward, but you managed to get through it. I take out the Martian cylinder, and it is mission accomplished. So admittedly, it's a little bit of a mixed bag here. I come out of this loving the music, I love the atmosphere and style of the game, really like the cutscenes, I even like it graphically, I think it looks great. But I'm apprehensive about the gameplay itself. It handles really awkwardly. The vehicles are fine when just driving about, but when you have to drive and fire, the aiming is just so awkward. And it does make me wonder how things are going to go on as the missions continue and things inevitably get harder. We go on to the second mission. We're charged in this one with fending off a Martian assault on the River Thames. We start in a static gun, shooting down waves of flying machines as they fly overhead before fighting machines come at us. There's nothing bad here in terms of difficulty, but I will again point out how awkward the gun feels when moving around. I can't pinpoint what is wrong here, it just feels imprecise. Now, speaking of imprecise, we move on to the next bit. Taking out the fighting machines whilst in a truck. Given my issues pointed out already with moving and aiming at the static targets, it was no surprise that I found it incredibly difficult and awkward to aim at the flying targets. There's nothing here to give me feedback on where to aim and the best way to adjust it. So it just didn't feel much fun to do so. It feels like it would have been better to have transported a static gun turret to a location, or maybe even allow for a pure shooting mode with an actual reticule when you're in the truck for some, or maybe a sort of aim assist. Now, I do appreciate that limitations at the time mean this probably wasn't possible, but you think about these things from a modern perspective, I suppose. Eventually, we do actually do it, and now I have to escort a truck along a road littered with fighting machines. Taking out the fighting machines in the truck isn't too bad due to the size of them and their limited movement. It's actually quite fun because you have to think about how you approach them, where you're aiming, the appropriate distances, moving back and forth. That wasn't too bad. Now, what wasn't fun was having to transport a transmitter to the top of a hill, only because I forgot to take the transmitter with me the first time. So I ended up getting to the top of the hill, then having to come back down, drive to the transmitter, and make the journey again. Afterwards though, we take out a few more Martians, we carry a bridge to get us across a river, and take out the cylinder. We're done with the second mission. And I'm not going to go into a blow-by-blow account of the third one. It starts out very much the same, but it introduces a neat new mechanic where you have to restore a factory. Then you have to collect bits of scrap metal along the way and use that, bring it back to the factory to build additional units for use in the mission. You don't have a choice at this point what the units are, but I do kind of expect that maybe in later missions it'll get a bit more involved. Beyond that, fairly straightforward. Get your vehicles, swap between them as required, defeat the Martians, and move on. Fourth mission didn't actually introduce anything new, and surprisingly didn't expand upon the RTS mechanic either. Except, very surprised at that, but it is what it is. Here we simply go from location to location, defend them, before we end up actually having to protect a moving train from flying machines whilst we were in a moving vehicle. This section didn't outstay its welcome, but we keep going back to it. It highlighted my biggest issue with the game, that driving and shooting is awkward. So, fifth mission. Start of this one, fending off waves of Martians using static cannons. I wasn't sure if it was possible to actually complete this objective, because I was shooting at the enemies pretty much as soon as I was able to and hitting them, but I wasn't able to stop them from destroying the turrets that I was on. The one good thing about it is that it didn't result in a game over. Instead, the game kind of adapts to let me know I'd get a smaller number of recruits for the mission. Being me, I was a little bit annoyed at that because it felt like the price segment was ridiculously difficult to do, but whatever. We keep going. Either I needed to be quicker or the game needed to dial it back a touch. From here though, nothing I hadn't seen before. Go to locations, destroy Martians, liberate people from farms, and shoot down flying machines. We wrap up the mission, and I think at this point it's probably a good time to check in with my thoughts on the game. So to wrap things up, I went into this game really wanting to love it, because I adore the source material so much. And it also stood out as something a little bit different, and I do like to explore games that were a little bit different at times. Unfortunately, a lot of my time with the game was spent being a little bit frustrated, and I came out of it being a touch disappointed. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't dislike the game, and I think for the time it came out, it's good. Probably very good. But I personally struggled to enjoy it like I thought I would. And it comes down to that core gameplay experience. It was just frustrating, it wasn't something I enjoyed, to the point where the thought of continuing it is actually really off-putting. Now, it's a shame, because I think the general package here, the presentation, and the effort put in is very good. You can see that there was passion put into this. You can see there was an attempt made to capture the spirit of the album. Things like the cutscenes and the remix of the songs are great, and I think the team did a really good job with it. This doesn't come across as a cheap or shameless cash-in, but something people actually cared about, which in a way is why I personally feel bad that it didn't fully click for me. But it's something that happens. It's a pitfall of looking back at older games and systems, especially those ones that maybe we didn't grow up with. How many people do you hear now talk about how bad their experiences with games are? These classic titles that we adored back then. You know, I grew up with the classic Tomb Raider, the classic Resident Evil, those old tank control platformers, things like Croc and that. And it really does, it pains me when I see people nowadays go, oh, you can't play Tomb Raider nowadays because it controls so awkwardly. Resident Evil is unplayable. Croc is horrendous. You even see people going back to some critically acclaimed N64 titles, your likes of Ocarina of Time and Mario 64, and they find them a struggle to play. And that, you know, for people who grew up with them, it must be so hard to hear that. But that is the way things go, and that's probably the case here for me with this game. I never grew up with vehicular combat games, the likes of Twisted Metal or Vigilante 8. I knew of them, but I never really played them, so they're a bit of an unknown quantity. Perhaps those of you who did, but those of you who are more well versed in it, you might enjoy this a bit more. Maybe even if I persevered more, it might eventually click. But as of the 5th mission, I was just really struggling it. So the question is Jeff Wayne's The War of the Worlds worth your time? Now, it's an interesting curiosity. You can see the potential there. I think fans of the original source material might get a lot more out of it, but if you're not as familiar with it, then I don't know how much value this would have for you. That said, I do strongly urge each and every one of you watching this to check out the original source material, because to this day, it still stands out to me as one of the greatest albums of all time. But now, I do want to hear from you. Was this a game you ever played? Are you a fan of the original album? And has this maybe piqued your interest? I know personally I kind of struggled with it a little bit, but I do want to know, did you enjoy this? Is this something you want to check out, despite the fact that maybe I didn't enjoy it as much? You want to get your own view on it? Do let me know in the comments down below, because I do want to hear from you all. And of course, for more retro gaming content, give the video a like and give this channel a subscribe. Until next time, thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this, and I will see you again in a future video. Goodbye.